5:07 p.m. State police helicopter drops it. There is the explosion.
And what you're looking at now is a live picture of the water cannons pouring high-pressured streams of water onto the top of the MOVE house.
30 years ago, when the MOVE activists were bombed here in Philadelphia, the ways in which this country was terrorizing black communities.
You made the decision to drop a damn bomb on my house. You ruined my life. At the bunker, they decided physically to let the bunker burn. They knew they was going to burn down the whole neighborhood. Who gave them people that power?
I know one thing. If it would ever happen in a white neighborhood, they would have snuffed it out right in the beginning.
You cannot understand what's happening in Black Atlanta unless you understand what's happening in Palestine. We have a GILEE program, which is Global International Law Enforcement Exchange. They're sending local police to go train with the IDF.
We have an active exchange program with Israeli police to help train and prepare the future cadre of the police leaders.
They are exchanging knowledge. They are talking to each other. It's important that we understand what is happening down there because the same forces over there are the same forces here that are putting us down.
I visited Israel in 2008 with the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange and was impressed with several practices I saw during my visit, so much so that I implemented several here in Atlanta.
These are the same people. They're exchanging knowledge. They're exchanging strategies.
Our Video Integration Center in downtown Atlanta, with more than 5,000 public and private sector cameras, is modeled after the command and control center I saw in the old city of Jerusalem.
Law enforcement officials from all corners of the country have traveled to Israel to learn police strategies and exchange tactics. These trips became increasingly common after 9/11 as pro-Israel groups used the so-called war on terror as an opportunity to push for a closer, unconditional alliance with Israel, which had marketed itself as the world's leading counterterrorism expert.
On these trips, high-ranking U.S. officials are visiting Israeli checkpoints and prisons, places where human rights groups all over the world have documented Israeli discrimination and repression and torture and killing of Palestinians.
I spoke to Stephanie Fox from the Jewish Voice for Peace. Her organization was part of a campaign called Deadly Exchange, which outlines the dangerous consequences of U.S. police trainings in Israel.
Why do you think Israel is so attractive to U.S. law enforcement agencies?
U.S. policing has always been both about enacting a war on black and brown communities in the U.S. and around the world. So I think that the two being both rooted in racism and state violence, there's a real natural attraction and a desire to trade tactics.
So who runs these exchanges? They're organized by pro-Israel groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which calls itself the world's leading anti-hate organization. The trips are funded privately as well as through grants from the Israeli and U.S. governments, including the Justice Department. The ADL boasts that they've trained more than 15,000 law enforcement professionals and have sent more than 200 high-ranking U.S. officials to Israel. And some officers fresh off these trips have high praise.
This was an outstanding experience, something that I'll remember for the rest of my life.
You've obviously given us a lot to think about, a lot of best practices.
And this is, in fact, the finest training initiative that I've ever been a participant in.
But we've seen the ramifications of these trainings here in the U.S., with police departments treating American citizens who are exercising their constitutional right to protest as though they're under occupation, especially communities of color. Take Ferguson, Missouri, for example. After the 2014 police killing of Michael Brown, the officers' response to protesters mirrored some of the tactics used by Israeli forces against Palestinians, which civil rights icon Angela Davis has drawn attention to.
The tear gas that was being used in occupied Palestine was the same tear gas that was being used in Ferguson.
And she's right. Officers in Ferguson used the same U.S. manufactured tear gas and flashbang devices to disperse crowds that Israeli forces regularly use against Palestinians. But that's not all. In 2011, the sheriff of St. Louis County, where Ferguson is located, traveled to Israel on one of the ADL-sponsored police exchange trips. And then, 3 years after the Ferguson uprisings, which catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement to the international stage, the city's police chief also traveled to Israel for training. He said he was blessed to be part of the exchange. And throughout all of this, Palestinians have recognized the shared struggle, even tweeting support and tips to American protesters. But Ferguson is just one example. Other cities and counties where officers have received Israeli training later became the sites of high-profile police killings. That includes Hennepin County, home to Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed by police, and Atlanta, where Rayshard Brooks was fatally shot by an officer. And who could forget the militarized response to protesters in Washington, D.C. after the death of George Floyd? Officers from several agencies, including the U.S. Park Police, fired on protesters with tear gas and flashbangs. And it turns out that many officers from D.C. traveled to Israel for training. And
that's why we say white supremacy is global, and that's why we say white Southern colonialism, we fight against it wherever it stands. That's why we're standing for the Palestinian people. We're standing here as concerned community with people who have lost their loved ones to police brutality, saying we have lost them. We know what it means to lose children to war. We know what it means to lose our loved ones to police. And we will not have it anymore.
In 1964, Malcolm X published an article in the Egyptian Gazette called Zionist Logic, in which he drew parallels between the oppression of Palestinians and Africans. Instead of seeing it as a religious conflict, Malcolm saw Israel as a colonial project serving a wider imperialist agenda, saying European imperialists wisely placed Israel where she could geographically divide the Arab world. In the same year, Malcolm was one of the first African leaders to publicly meet with the Palestine Liberation Organization, as anti-colonial struggles gained traction through the world. Freedom for Palestinians became a touchstone for the international fight against imperialism. As black freedom movements expanded their worldview to situate their struggle as part of a global anti-colonial movement, Palestine also became an important focal point of their solidarity. On August 15, 1967, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee released a position paper entitled The Middle East Crisis, expressing support for Palestine and criticizing U.S. support for Israel. Organizations such as the Black Panthers argued that freedom would never come for black people in America unless all oppressed people were free. The Panthers frequently spoke of black communities and their relationship with police as living under occupation as internally colonized people. They were vocal in their support for Palestine and met with the PLO in Algiers in 1962.